Hey there, welcome to The Empowered Edge, the podcast that gives you nutrition, mindset, and habit building strategies that actually work. I'm your host, Jenna Hostetler, registered dietitian, certified neurocoach, and your go-to guide to break free from burnout, cut through the health noise, and reclaim control of your body and brain. Each week, you'll get practical, science-backed strategies so you can stop second-guessing yourself, sharpen your focus, and finally feel like the woman who leads her life, not just survives it. You know when you hear something and you think, this would sound absolutely insane if it didn't make perfect sense? Kind of the whole reality is crazier than fiction type thing. Well, that's the majority of this interview. When I stumbled across Dr. Joan Ifland, who has a PhD in Addictive Nutrition, I was a little bit beside myself and in total disbelief that she agreed to an interview. So buckle up because these next 20 minutes are going to be a wild ride. So Dr. Joan Ifland has a PhD in addictive nutrition, and she founded the online addiction reset community where she helps people recover from food addiction. And from the brief chat that we had a few weeks ago, the diet industry really does make food addiction worse. So I'm really excited to chat with her today and see what awesome wisdom she has for us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate being here.
So can you talk a little bit about how food addiction starts? Because I know, I watched that wonderful video on your site and we talked about it a little bit, but when did this become a problem?
So it really started in the early 1900s with steel rollers in the flour mills. And then they could turn grains into such a fine powder that the body absorbed them quickly. Grains have natural endorphins in them. Wheat has a gluteomorphine in it. And if you have to chew it a long time and the food gets into your system slowly, that's one thing. But when you really highly refine it, there's enough of a high that you have a crash and you can develop an addiction. Fast forward to 1963, and you see the first entrant of a tobacco company into sugar. You see a tobacco company buying Hawaiian Punch and rebranding it from an alcoholic drink mixer into a sugary drink for children. And the cartoon character, the punchy mascot, making it very available, putting it in the juice boxes that look like cigarette packages, same coloring. You see the beginning of the transference of the tobacco addiction business model to sugar for children. And then in 1980, we have a big uptick in addiction, processed food addiction. And that is when high fructose corn syrup comes on the market. Why is that so important? Because the addiction business model requires the product, the addictive product, to be cheap enough, to be bought often enough to create the addiction. So while their fellow cartel, the sugar cartel in Florida, had control over sugar pricing, tobacco wasn't going into processed foods. But with the introduction of high fructose corn syrup, very, very cheap, we have a good study showing how high fructose corn syrup moves through the body like corn alcohol. So a very cheap, very addictive sweetener came on the market, and boom, 5 years later, the tobacco industry buys 10% of the food industry in 3 years. Kraft, Nabisco, and General Foods were taken over by an addiction company, the tobacco industry, and they brought their addiction business model with them over to processed foods. And that's where obesity really takes off. That's where diet-related diseases take off from. It's tobacco all over again. It's smoking epidemic all over again, except 10 times worse, because they're allowed to prey on children. The tobacco industry was not allowed to prey on children, but now we have the processed food industry preying on children.
Okay, I need to recap what you just said because my mind is going so many places right now.
Okay.
So it's just crazy that nobody knows this. So the price of sugar was the barrier to the tobacco industry really getting into the food industry.
Mm-hmm.
So when high fructose corn syrup came around and it was super cheap, then that was kind of their door into the industry. They buy up 10%, all snacky companies.
Yeah.
And I mean, we see high fructose corn syrup in everything, and it
Mm-hmm.
has been there for a while.
Yeah.
So where does somebody begin when they're trying to get out of this insane food system that we have?
So we do have a self-quiz at foodaddictionreset.com. And I would encourage anybody to go over there. These are the 11 diagnostic criteria for addiction, particularly alcoholism. We've reworded them for processed foods. I validated this approach in my doctoral work. I have published on it. And there are 11 signs. There are 11 signs of addiction, and they appear in overeating. I have done recent research on how prevalent are these signs in the US population. I will say that if you are experiencing 6 out of these 11, that's the threshold for a severe addiction. And you know, Jenna, that I wrote the textbook for the field full-time, 3 years, 2,000 studies. And what I got out of this is that people not only are suffering from processed food addiction, but they are suffering at a severe level. The tobacco industry has been applying this business model to processed foods for 35 years or so, close to 35 years. And I've done the extrapolation of the rat research. For a human, it only takes about 6 months of a processed food diet to develop the addiction. And here we are, we've been just bombarded with these substances. They're not really food. The body interprets them as drugs for over 35 years. And we're to the point where 1.6 million Americans will die from diet-related diseases this year, which is about 2.5 times worse than COVID ever was. So we're working very hard to train. I mean, I want to train an army of people to be equipped. This is a very tricky disease. It's not recognized at all in the culture. So I'm so grateful to you, Jenna. So this is treatable. Those 1.6 million deaths, had they been treated with the right level of care for a severe addiction, I don't know how many of them would have survived, but some. This is treatable. It can be put into remission. And then when you put the addiction into remission and you're not tempted by processed foods anymore, you would be amazed at how many other diseases go into remission right along with it. So there we know, because we've had this recovery community online for almost 5.5 years now. And we've seen all kinds of other diseases go into remission. So we now have really good evidence that processed foods are crippling cell function, which is why so many different diseases will go into remission: mental, emotional, and physical diseases, a very broad range. Because if your cells are working, you don't have disease, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if your cells are constantly being bombarded with things that make them malfunction or die prematurely, you almost don't have a chance. And it's so frustrating when all of these diseases are so obviously fixable, but it's like people don't want to address it. And the people who need to address it because they can impact the most won't.
Well, wait, hang on. I can offer you a reframing of people don't want to. No, that's people are buying weight loss programs, eating disorder programs, food plan programs by the hundreds of millions. They want to, but they're being misdiagnosed. So we have some very recent research showing, this is research that reviewed 80 some other studies of brain scans of people with eating disorder diagnoses, for example. They all had evidence of addiction in their brains. Eating disorders to me is kind of like saying, well, cocaine use is a snorting disorder. Now, eating is just how the drug gets into your system.
Wow.
So we do know that people are being referred to eating disorder programs who are actually processed food addicted. And then the eating disorder programs, they don't have the skill set and the resources to actually help somebody through the process of getting off of, withdrawing from the processed foods. So instead, they've fallen back on this idea that you could learn how to use these highly addictive substances in moderation. That's just it's just a fantasy. We have research showing that rats will choose sugar and saccharin over heroin and cocaine. These are highly addictive substances. And the idea that you would just say to somebody, oh, stop eating sugar. It's like, no, they need treatment. They need to be in an immersion community where their brains can be protected from cueing and they can get restorative messaging. You are okay. You are great. You never failed. Those programs were broken before they hit the ground, and that's not your fault. So the diet industry, we know, makes processed food addiction worse. When you don't eat enough food, you wake up the fear of famine brain, and then it joins in the addiction, and you're just being driven crazy by thoughts of food all day. That's all very fixable.
Are there certain ingredients or just, well, first of all, so you mentioned flour. You mentioned that the fine white flour that we have is very different than eating grains 100 years ago when you had like access to it. So are there other things that people would perceive as like whole foods or real food that are actually not doing you justice?
Yes. Oh, that's such a good question. So I was talking to a reporter earlier this week about stevia, for example. People say, well, stevia is a plant. I can chew on a stevia leaf. We have 35 years of having our reward systems hyperactivated, hypersensitized, and made hyper-reactive. What does that mean? It means that when they're stimulated just a little bit, they release a flood of cravings. And there's enough neurotransmitter to get control of your behavior. This is not your fault. That we see this on the brain scan studies. The cravings go straight over to the behavior centers in the midbrain. They don't come anywhere close to the frontal lobe where you make decisions. So the idea that you should have more willpower is just cruel. It's not true. It's not a willpower issue. It's an addiction issue. And when somebody says to you, yeah, just don't have enough willpower, you don't want this bad enough, you're too lazy, that is cruel. That is gaslighting. That is psychological abuse. The practitioner or whoever's saying it doesn't have a clue what it means to live in an addicted brain. That you didn't addict. The tobacco industry addicted your brain to all these substances. Okay, back to your question. Little detour rant there.
That's because it gets questions about stevia a lot.
Yes. So when your brain is that sensitive, you can't. You run the risk of creating a flood of cravings by any kind of a concentrated sweet taste. So that sweet taste hits the taste bud, and it sends a jolt up to the brain. So in recovery, we gradually figure out whether we can tolerate even high sugar fruits. Can we tolerate banana, or does banana give us cravings? Or any of the tropical fruits, or cherries, or grapes? There are a lot of people in recovery who can't eat those. You know, I don't know if you've ever had this experience of bringing home a bunch of cherries or grapes and just standing over the sink and eating them compulsively until they're gone. But that's a good indicator that they're too sweet. They're making you engage in behavior that's not in your best interest. So there's that. And then, of course, gluten has a morphine in it. Mother Nature made foods not to just prevent us from dying of starvation. Mother Nature made them pleasurable. She put a little bit of endorphin in these edible plants. And that's fine, and that's pleasurable, and that's just normal until you concentrate it. And it's the processing itself that concentrates the endorphin, lets it get into your system quickly enough to create a high followed by a crash and more cravings. That's the problem. So then you get into excessive salt that has been shown to release to activate the opioid pathways in the brain. You get dairy. And dairy has 4 natural casomorphines in it. 4. The cow puts morphine in the milk, raw milk, right out of the organic cow, because that baby calf is supposed to go to sleep after it eats, so it can be still and absorb nutrients. So all breast milk, all mammal breast milk has naturally occurring morphine in it to put the baby to sleep. Adults don't need that. It's just, it makes us dull. If, often people they'll start with the sugar, they'll give up the sugar, and then they'll move on to flour, they'll give up the flour and the gluten, and then maybe they'll move on to excessive salt, and then finally get to dairy. And they think, well, dairy is not a big problem until they give it up. And then after about 10 days, you get this incredible mental clarity. And you can see, you can feel, you can sense how that dairy was just numbing you out. It's got 4 different casomorphines in it. And then there's excessive fat. And I'm really excited about this new research. It came out of the University of Boston and the director of the lab is Pedro Coton, and they nailed it. They showed how excessive fat. So they gave the rats full access to as much fat as they wanted, and how it's super activated the same pathway as cannabis, the cannabinoid pathways. Yes. So when you go to get on a keto diet, you're excited at the beginning because your sugar addiction is not just driving you crazy, but gradually over time, the fat addiction takes its place. So please don't ever get on a food plan that restricts carbohydrates unless you're being treated, unless you've taken the self-quiz at least, and you know whether you're suffering from food addiction, because otherwise the addiction will just transfer to fat, and then the sugar addiction will reappear. Now you've got 2 addictions. You've got the fat addiction and the sugar addiction, and that's lethal. I mean, that will just make you really sick. And then, of course, you have caffeine, and then you have food additives. So this is one of the reasons why this addiction can become so severe, and why people need immersion, long-term access, because all 4 of the major addiction pathways are affected. All 4 of them are hyperactivated: dopamine and serotonin and opioid and cannabinoid. So this is not your fault. And any program that is not a match for that level of care needed for a severe addiction, it will fail. Not because you failed. No matter what they tell you, you're not trying hard enough. That is a lie. To me, that's a lie. The program failed. It was broken before you ever joined. Could never have been strong enough to beat a severe, deeply embedded addiction. Don't just please stop blaming yourself right now.
Yeah, and that's so sad too. That's the situation.
I have to tell you, I respect that she called me out when I said that people don't really want to acknowledge that so many diseases are fixable with diet. But I still believe that people spend so much money on these fixes because they're advertised as being simple and easy. I think in general, most people want the easy fix because they don't want to build up the discipline of saying no. Because building discipline and consistency and being committed is one of the hardest things you will ever do. And maybe it's so hard to do because people are addicted to what they've been eating, and sticking to a healthy diet is far harder than it should be. I did find it fascinating what she said about flour. I've never bought into the theory that humans are not made to eat grains. Bread was a staple in the Bible. People have been grinding grains into flour from the beginning of time. And while I believe that most people can't tolerate it today because of what we've done to it, I don't believe we were never meant to eat it. So I thought her comment about the problem being how fine we grind it now to be very interesting, and I would love to see some studies on that. But if you've struggled with food addiction or cravings or just an inability to stay away from highly processed foods, go to Dr. Ifland's website. I'll put it in the show notes and see what resources she has there for you. Because the only way to get freed from the food industry is to take back control of your life and your resources. And that starts with things just like this. Next week, we will finish the conversation with Dr. Ifland. And until then, take action on whatever awesome goal you're working on. Stay empowered, and I'll see you next time. Okay, now before you pop off, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the one episode that could change your life. And give us a 5-star review if you learned something new today. If you want to check out all the awesome free guides, templates, and resources I've given away on this podcast, go to theneurodietitian.com/resources. You can grab anything you want, but only if you'll do it. Because information without implementation is worthless. And here at The Empowered Edge, we're action takers, not excuse makers.